Hey, what is up, YouTube? Alright, today we're going to be doing a 12-hour stream, building 3 projects. Still learning, so I'm just going through a course. Just join me if you want. Alright, already a little bit into the fancy counter project. Well, let's keep going.
Actually, so I can put the cursor on this line. I can hold Shift and Option down arrow key for Mac, or on Windows it's going to be Shift Alt down arrow key. And you now have 2 reset buttons. So if I save here, we now have 2 reset buttons, right? So with components you can also easily use the same logic in multiple places. Now let's actually talk a little bit more about components and how they are typically structured. So let me close this one and let's actually just take the count component. So previously I said that a component is just a JavaScript function. Now the only difference is the name of the function should be capitalized. And I'm using a traditional function syntax here. Now in JavaScript maybe you know that we also have arrow functions. And you can use them as well. So if I comment this out, or actually let me just copy this and paste this here. In case you're coding along, you don't have to do this. I'm just quickly going to demonstrate this. So an arrow function would look like this. So we have const and then the name, well, that should still be uppercase. And that's just a JavaScript variable, and then you assign an arrow function to it. That's how you would do it. So if I save here, we then also have this semicolon here. And this will work the exact same actually. Now here, if we want to export it with an arrow function, you can actually not do this. So export default. You cannot export variables like this. So here, if you want to make it the default export, you have to do it after, which is no big deal, but it's just a small syntactical difference. So why do I use the traditional function and not the arrow function syntax for my components? I don't have a strong opinion on that. I'm just picking one and just being consistent. Now I do like that if you are working in a component and you may have some, let me comment this out, and you have some event handler function. We'll talk more about this. But what you could have here before the return statement is you could have some other logic, some other functions even, and maybe a function that will deal with a click event, as we'll see. And this is going to be a function. Now I like that these functions are then arrow functions. So any inner function, I make those arrow functions. So then I can easily contrast them with my actual component functions. But this is purely personal preference, and my preference isn't even strong at all. So you can perfectly fine use this as well if you want. But there is a difference here with exporting. So if you want to export an arrow function as the default, you have to do this. Alright, so what else do we need to know about components and how they are structured? Well, let's actually think about a normal JavaScript function. Typically, you can call them whatever you want. So we can call that blah blah. So a JavaScript function will use traditional function but works the exact same with arrow functions. They can return something. Right? I can return the number 5. And in a function for React, a React component, whatever you return is what you will get here where you are using it. So here for count, whatever we return will be put here. Right? So here we get this paragraph. If I would return the number 5 from count, I would get the number 5 here. That works the exact same as with normal JavaScript functions. And normal JavaScript functions can also take inputs. Right? So maybe this function blah blah receives an input, and we can call that whatever we want. We can call that text. And the only thing that this function does is maybe capitalize the text. Capitalized text. It will just take that input, uppercase it, and then maybe return that, right? And a more descriptive name would be something like capitalize text. Right, so this is a normal JavaScript function. I'm not using it anywhere in this file, so I'm getting a warning. But it can have an input, we uppercase it, and that's what we return here. Let me comment this out, and it works the exact same. We have a component function here, return something, and it can also get an input here. And this input is managed by React, and this input is called the props. So here we have props, we can do something with the props. For example, maybe instead of hard coding the number 0 here, maybe it should be whatever is the input. Right, so the input will determine what the number is, and we can actually assign that to a separate variable. So we can do it like this, a const, the actual count number, let's say, is coming from props. Now props is an object with all the inputs. So we can have multiple inputs to this function, and it will all be put in this object that we typically call props. So here we can actually just extract maybe a number. Right? There could also be other things in there like blah blah and other props. So functions can return something and they get inputs. And it works the exact same in React. So here we have a function that returns something, and it can also receive inputs. And where do those inputs come from? Well, that's when you use the component. So here we are using that count. And currently count is always displaying the number 0. We always have the number 0 right now. And maybe we want to control that ourselves here when we use that component. So what you can do is you can pass so-called props. So just like on a div element in HTML, you can do things like type is submit. Right? So in HTML you would have an attribute, and then you would have submit, let's say. And it works the exact same with React components. So here we can also say type is submit if I wanted to, right? But that doesn't make any sense for count here. So what would make sense for count? Well, maybe the number that should be displayed. So number is, let's say, and actually it's a number, so that could be the number 5, let's say. So this is a string. Right, now a number maybe should be the number type, so then you do have to use curly braces here. Alright, so now this count will have an input. Right, so now just like a normal JavaScript function, the input, React will make that available here as an input. And we typically call that input props. Now props will hold all the inputs. So here we pass one prop, the number prop, but we can also have other things like maybe size. Maybe this component can be in 2 different sizes, and we want to specify here when we use it, should it be the large or the medium, should it be large or small. So we can just say size is large, let's say. So now we are passing 2 strings to this count component. This count component receives them as props. This is one object that will hold all of the props. So now if we just want to get the count, what we can do, the count number, we can just say count number, and we can get that by using props. So it's going to be an object, and then it's the name of the prop. So here we call that number, so it's going to be dot number, right? And here we assign the string 5 to that. So here what we should get is the number 5. So here what we should get is the string 5 that we assign to count number here. And now instead of hard coding the number 0 here all the time, and if we want to get the other prop, the size, well, we can do the same thing here. I get some REST quickly lines here from ESLint because, for example, I'm not using the count number so far. So what we can do is we can say the size is props dot, well, how did we call that prop? Size. Right, so here I can just extract the thing that I want from the props object. And now we get some REST quickly lines here because, for example, size, we are not using that. So ESLint is trying to warn us, like, why are you creating variables and not using them? Which is not a big deal, but it's just currently how ESLint is configured, and we could go in here and change that. We also get a REST quickly line here with props.number and props.size. Because when you try to access things on the props object, well, maybe you want to make sure that they actually exist, right? So that I'm not just making a mistake here trying to access something that I never passed as a prop. By default, also ESLint wants you to validate that this exists before you actually start using it. However, this is a better use case for TypeScript, so we'll do that with TypeScript later. We will not do that here. So now we have extracted the count number and the size, but how do we use it? Because these are JavaScript variables, and here with P, it's kind of like an HTML setting. So how can we use this JavaScript variable in this sort of HTML setting? Right. So here instead of hard coding 0, we would like to use count number. right? So count number. This is my JavaScript variable, and typically you would, reference that by just its name. So if I do this, we should get the actual number here now that we passed here, which is 5, right? That's maybe what you would expect. But if we now go here, you can see that it actually has literally rendered count number. So that's not what we want. So here, if you actually want to run the JavaScript as you intended, essentially, you need to open a JavaScript window here, and you do that with curly braces, right? So we're essentially creating a JavaScript window, and in here we can write normal JavaScript, and that will be rendered here in the HTML. So if we now save this and go back, you can see we now have 5 here. Right, so just to recap, we have passed some information essentially to this count component. We call that props, and this is the number prop, this is the size prop, and React will put all of that in one object, which we typically call props, and we can extract props.number to get the actual number here, which is the string 5, and then we have size, and also we are passing this as a string. Now typically, here we would use a number type. So how do you pass a number type? Because if I do the number 5, this doesn't work. Right, so here everything but a string needs to be in curly braces. So also I can pass, for example, a boolean, like true. I can also pass an array even with data. I can also pass another object actually. So now you get 2 sets of curly braces. Right, but in this case we would want a number 5. And so now here for props number, we would get a number 5. If I would go back, it still works the exact same. Right? Maybe good to mention, I don't have to refresh or anything. Right? So as soon as you save something, the server that we are still running here, right? So this is still running. I just opened up my terminal again. It's still running in the background as I pull this down and close it like that. It's still running there, and it will automatically update the screen if you make a change here. All right. Now typically we don't. Alright, so the benefit of this is now when I use the count component, I can determine what the number should be from where I'm using it. So previously we were always hard-coding the number 0. But now whenever I use the count component, I can say, well, the number should be 5 or 10. And I only have to write it here, save here. Now when I come back, it's the number 10. Right, so with props, you essentially give control to the parent component. The card component here is the parent of the count. So from the count's perspective, it's getting some instructions essentially from the parent. And here is how we extract that data, and then we can determine what we do with that data here. Alright, let me clean things up a little bit here. Let me remove this. Now these days, we don't typically get this number and size like this. Now you could do it, but typically it's done in a different way. It's done by destructuring. So here, we can write the exact same. If I just comment this out, we can write the exact same by doing the following. So we can say props. What we want to get from there is the size. Let's see, we have size is large. So you can use curly braces. Let me actually remove number for now, just to make it clear. So we have props. It's an object, and an object has properties. And let me actually just show you what we will get as props. And so props is essentially the following. What we get here. We get something called number, because that's how we call this prop, and then we also have size, which is LG is the value that we gave it. So React will look at this, it will create an object called props with the following properties, right? So with number and size, and that's why it's called props, right? Short for properties. Now from an object we can do destructuring, right? So we can get this, if we just want the size, we can do this. Right? That's what we get here. Now let me remove this because now we have 2 identifiers for props. But that's basically what props is. That's what React creates for you. And we can get the size from there with destructuring, as it's called. And then if we want to get the number, we can just do comma number, right? Or any other property that may be on that object. And then we can use number here to get the actual number. Now previously we called it count number. So here, if you want to give it a different name, you can do colon, and we could call that count number. Now this is more advanced, you can rename when you do destructuring. Let me actually not do that, so let's actually just use the same names as the props here. So number, that's what we get here, so number. And then if you want to use it, well, you would just use number. right? I get red squiggly lines here for the same reason. We're trying to extract size and number from the props object, but we haven't validated that they actually exist or should exist as part of the props. We will ignore that for now. If I save here, if I now go back, you can see we still get the number 10. If I change this to the number 6, if I save here, we still see the number 6, because 6 is passed as a value for number. We extract the number from the props here, and that's what we use here. Alright, now just to take it one step further, this is typically also not how it's done these days, this destructuring here. The destructuring still occurs, but it's done immediately here. So we can do the exact same. If I just copy this, we can actually already do that immediately here, where we accept the props as an input, as a parameter. So you just write the exact same actually. So here, if I just remove everything now, this is the exact same as what we were just doing here. And so now we don't even have the word props, we can just remove this. If I save here, and I go back, it still works the exact same, but this is much cleaner syntax. So here, we are immediately destructuring whatever we get as the input prop. Right, so it looks a little bit complicated, but we will practice with this much more, so don't worry. This is a prop, this is how you pass props to a component, but it's just a normal JavaScript function that just accepts an input, and it happens to be an object that we immediately destructure here as the parameter. So then we can immediately use number, or if we wanted to, could use size here. We're not going to use size here, just an example if you have multiple props. But that is basically the anatomy of a React component. Previously we had class components as well, but now with hooks, as we'll see, everything is very functional, and React recommends to only use functional components now. There's one more thing I want to mention about components, which is that we can also have multiple components in the same file. So I could technically write a new component here, and remember, it's just a JavaScript function. We could maybe call it count title, right? Just a normal function. The only difference is it's a capital K, so we know it's going to be a React component. And maybe this could be, for example, an h2 saying something like current count is colon. And maybe we want to put this on top of the number, right? So if I save here, we get some formatting. But now we want to put this count title on top of the number. So how do we do that? Let's see. I can try something like this, count title. And now we have this on top of the P. And if I save here, do we get formatting? And no, we actually get an error. Because in a React component, you always need to return one thing. You cannot return multiple things. And actually that's the same with a normal JavaScript function as well, right? So you need to return one thing, and here we're trying to return two things. So you would have a div, and then you can just select these two lines, and then I can hold Option up arrow key to move it. On Windows it's Alt up arrow key. And then I can move them in here, and then save for formatting. And then I get this div. This is one thing that we're returning now, and this div just holds the two things, right? So this is how you can structure it. And now we are using a component here that's defined in the same file. And that's no problem. So if we go back now, you can see that it all is working. We have current count is, and that's going to be this one, right? So that's coming from this one. We don't have to export this one because maybe we don't want to use this in another file, so we can just leave it like this without any export keyword. And this is perfectly fine to do, and especially if you have a component and it has some smaller components that are only related to that component, it makes sense to just use one file for that. You don't have to create a new file for each component that you're going to create. For the vast majority of components, it is the case that you're going to have one dedicated file for it. But it's not necessary, right? So React does not mandate us to create a new file for each component. Technically, we could split up all these components and just define all of that in here in the same file if we wanted to. But for organizational purposes, people tend to separate them into separate files. And if you want to use something from a different file, we use the export and import syntax. Right, so these days that's called ES modules. That's the modern format, and that's how we do it with export and import. Now maybe you've also seen the module.export syntax. This is common.js, and it's considered a legacy syntax, but sometimes you will still see this. So this is how you would export things, and then to import it, you would use require. right? So you would require something, and then you would get that here, right? So this is common JS syntax. However, these days we use ES and modules. That's export and import and export default, right? So slightly different syntax, but sometimes you may still see that older syntax. As for example, here with ESLint, they are using the CJS extension, and they are indeed using module.exports. Right, but over time it will become this ES modules syntax that will become the dominant one. Alright, now here we wrapped these two in a div. And if we now go here and inspect the HTML here, I see a semicolon here, so I think we have a semicolon too much, yeah? So let me remove this one. So if we now inspect the HTML here, let's see, so we have this h1, and then here we have that div. And that div now holds the current count is and then number 6. So what we have done now, by adding this div, because we can only return one thing, we have now altered the HTML structure. And that can be a problem, especially for styling, because Flexbox and CSS Grid, they depend on the structure of the HTML. So if we change the structure of the HTML, we may break our layout, we may cause damage. So we don't want to unnecessarily add things to our HTML. So if you do need one thing here, but we do need to wrap this in something, so why not a div? Well, because it alters the HTML, but what alternative do we have? Well, React has created the React fragment to solve this problem. So it's basically just empty tag, so you just have the angle brackets. If I save here, you can see it still works, right? So it still works. And now if you look at the HTML, you can see we have the h2 and paragraph without that surrounding div, right? So now we didn't change the structure of the HTML, but we still are returning one thing here. So React will make sure that works. So let me close out number 6. So what we have done now, by adding this div, because we can only return one thing, we have now altered the HTML structure. And that can be a problem, especially for styling, because Flexbox and CSS Grid, they depend on the structure of the HTML. So if we change the structure of the HTML, we may break our layout, we may cause damage. So we don't want to unnecessarily add things to our HTML. So if you do need one thing here, but we do need to wrap this in something, so why not a div? Well, because it alters the HTML, but what alternative do we have? Well, React has created the React fragment to solve this problem. So it's basically just empty tag, so you just have the angle brackets. If I save here, you can see it still works, right? So it still works. And now if you look at the HTML, you can see we have the h2 and paragraph without that surrounding div, right? So now we didn't change the structure of the HTML, but we still are returning one thing here. So React will make sure that works. So let me close out of here, you can see it still works. Now this is the shorthand format of the React fragment. You can also write it out, so you can actually just write it react.fragment. You have to copy this and paste this here. And now this will not work because it doesn't know what this React fragment is. We need to import that. So let's see if we can import that a bit more easier. So for now we have to write the last character here, and then it will suggest the import. Then I can press tab and it will import React for us. And now you can use React dot and whatever is available on that React namespace. And this is also why when we were using that extension to create new components, it added this import React from React, because sooner or later you're going to do something with that React variable, for example React.fragment. So you may want to add that to your component files already from the start. However, you don't need to use a React variable. You can also do it the other way, like React fragment. Just import the fragment from the React, like this, and then you can just use fragment. Right, it all works the exact same way. I prefer this syntax. I don't like to use React dot and React dot somewhere else. I just like to be clear about what this is. This is a fragment, and we can also import it like this, but it all works the same way. The fragment specifically here, I don't even use the word fragment, because we have this shorthand, so we don't even need any of this, but sometimes you will see this with other people's code. Alright, so let me clean things up a little bit here. Let me remove this. We will still just return a number here, and let me remove the props as well. And let's just hard code the number 0. and we will just have a clean component. Here again, and let's also remove these props. Alright, and now we can continue building our app. Alright, so I'm not sure